You know why we started reading Berserk in the first place? It wasn't the gore that attracted us, nor was it causality or any of the other supernatural elements of the series. It was the medieval fantasy setting, and the fact that the first couple of arcs were absolutely stacked with knights in shining armor. However, as the story progressed, we realized that the armor was the only thing making these guys knights, because there's a true dearth of actually heroic characters in Berserk. Well, except for this guy, of course, because he might be goofy and technically homeless at the moment, but Sir Azan the Bridge Knight is a legend for a reason. He's the only true knight in a world full of fakes, and in this video we'll be taking a look at what makes him a true knight and why he might end up being the inspiration for a positive change in this filthy world when all is said and done. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. The state of knighthood in Berserk. What makes Azan a true knight? As we said in the intro, Berserk is a world that's filled with knights and yet strangely devoid of them at the same time. What we mean by this is that the knights of Berserk aren't always true knights. They're men with titles who exploit and abuse the privileges that come along with it. You can check out our video where we ranked the various knightly characters of Berserk based on the traditional sense of what a knight should be, and if you've already seen it, then you know who was at the top of that list. If you don't, you're going to find out soon enough, but before we reveal that information, let's briefly talk about the quote-unquote evil knights of Berserk, those who use their privilege and position to do the exact opposite of what a knight is supposed to do. First up, we have any knight from the Tudor Empire, save one guy, Boss Khan. The Tudor Empire served as the main antagonists of the Golden Age arc and the only spin-off novel from Berserk, which focuses on the story of the Apostle Grunbeld. They're aggressive, they're relentless, and they don't care about the consequences of their actions, many of which are heinous at best and downright disgusting at worst. Perhaps it's because the Tudor Empire didn't care for the traditional honor codes of knighthood that they were able to expand as far and wide as they did, for the first numbered chapter of Berserk introduces all their forces as being quite formidable, even if they're overly cruel. A mere force of 3,000 horsemen was able to rip one of Midland's regular army units to shreds until the Band of the Falcon intervened, and the less we say about the Blue Whale Knights, led by the rather pompous and goofy, yet equally deadly Adon Cobblerwitz, the better. He had secret hidden techniques named after his family for literally everything, including firing a crossbow, and the only knightly order from the Tudor Empire that even barely resembled what true knights should be like was the Holy Purple Rhino Knights, led by their famous general, Boss Khan. Boss Khan was a loyal man and a valiant warrior, capable of taking on a demon like Guts in one-to-one combat, and nearly beating him as well. He believed in the traditional codes of knighthood, but only to the extent to which he could personally benefit from them. He was honorable, yet he served under Governor-General Genin, who was a known pedophile and child abuser. He was a great warrior, but he only focused on honing his personal skills as opposed to instilling his men with the pure ideals of knighthood. He wasn't chivalrous in the least bit, as evidenced by the fact that he allowed the exploitation of children under Genin despite knowing his nature. And, worst of all, he worked for an empire that practically enslaved half of Grant and brought chaos, death, and destruction to Grunbeld's homeland in the Flame Dragon Knight light novel. A few knights from Berserk are the complete opposite of monsters like the Tudor Knights, like Sir Owen and Sir Laban, but we haven't seen them engaging in direct combat as much, and the story only utilizes them as gateways that allow us to see what Griffith is up to, while Guts carries on with his quest for vengeance. Really, the only two knights whose stories we follow in a loaded capacity are Guts and Griffith, and you all know that tale quite well by now. But at the beginning of the Conviction arc, Yoda really introduced a proper honest-to-God knight in his medieval fantasy story with the character of Azan. Azan debuted in chapter 95 as the vice commander of the Holy Iron Chain Knights, which was being led by pre-Enlightenment Farnesay at the time. And right off the bat, he comes off as the old-timer veteran who worships at the altar of God in duty and laments the modern state of affairs. While working on a sacred mission to confirm a miracle recorded within the scriptures of the Holy See, Azan and the Holy Iron Chain Knights cross a woman and her child, and Serpico, who was still putting on his goofball act at this point in the story, asks him if the mother was Azan's type. Azan responds with the typical temper of a man who takes his vows seriously, chastising Serpico for peeking at girls while on a solemn duty and declaring himself a clergyman, which implies that he is vowed to remain chaste. He even goes so far as to say he won't ever take a woman as his wife, which was actually quite a common practice for monastic knights back in the day. The Knights Templar, for instance, were founded as a protection force for pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land, and they had to swear vows vows that included not getting married or fathering children because their duty was more sacred than a regular knight's. Love is the death of duty, as George R.R. Martin likes to say throughout his magnum opus, A Song of Ice and Fire, and it looks like Azan believes in that ideal too. In fact, he takes it a bit further than that when he calls Serpico an ungrateful dog for not focusing on the task at hand. All this leads us to one conclusion with regards to his character. Azan is a hard man who takes honor and chivalry seriously, and he's constantly frustrated by the fact that his much younger subordinates don't seem to understand the meaning of those words. His bickering with Serpico is put to bed when the Holy Iron Chain Knights finally arrive at the site of Griffith's eclipse, and witnessing the gruesome and bloody aftermath of that event leaves them all disturbed. Not just because of the carnage they were seeing, but also because it was a confirmation that their mission objective was not based on false rumors. Azan is the first to utter the first line of the now infamous Prophecy of the Falcon, which we'll discuss in another video someday, and he seems just as anxious as everyone else that the prophesized Age of Darkness will soon be upon the world. The Holy Iron Chain Knights had been tasked with hunting down the Falcon of Darkness associated with the prophecy, and at first, they assumed that the man is none other than Guts. They have a fair reason for making that assumption because during his days as the Black Swordsman, Guts left so much death and destruction in his wake that he felt like a walking, talking war crime machine. After chapter 95, we see Azan return during the Lost Children mini-arc, where we get proper examples of his chivalrous nature. After finally tracking Guts down to the village of the girl called Jill, the Holy Iron Chain Knights find a volunteer in the form of Zepik, a former soldier who's also Jill's abusive father. They agree to take him on as a guide to the Misty Valley, and Zepik is all too happy to do so because it lets him relive his glory days. In chapter 111, we see the Holy Iron Chain Knights reach the entrance to the Misty Valley, and while it's clear to us that Zepik's eagerness to assist is entirely personal, Azan starts crying because he believes it's for noble reasons. He thinks Zepik is anxious to get his daughter to safety from a man who leaves piles of corpses in his wake, and to be fair to him, he has no idea what Zepik is really like. When Azan sees what Guts did to Rosine's quote-unquote guardians, his expression hardens and he follows Farnace's order to shut up about the prophecy and continue their search in silence with regards to the same, indicating his obedient and loyal nature. Though he's far more experienced than Farnace at pretty much everything, Azan follows the chain of command because that's what a knight does. When his group finally catches up with Guts in chapter 116, Azan commends Zepik for stopping Guts from killing a downed Rosine by firing a crossbow at him, but he tells Zepik to stay with the children and protect them because following the Black Swordsman is too dangerous a task for a guy like him. Azan foolishly assumes that Zepik must be delighted to be reunited with his daughter and tells him that this is where they part ways, but his words reveal his nature. He's a man who truly believes in defending the defenseless and protecting the innocence of the world, and he believes in those ideals so much that he's blind to Zepik's true nature, which Serpico picks up on immediately. Also, Azan telling Zepik to stay behind because dealing with the Black Swordsman was too dangerous for him is proven correct when the Holy Iron Chain Knights finally corner Guts because he wastes no time in wasting several of them. One of Azan's roles as the vice commander of the Holy Iron Chain Knights is to train his subordinates in the art of combat. While he does his best to drill discipline and skill into them, Azan can only train them. He can't fight their battles for them, and that showed in the battle with the Black Swordsman. Despite being heavily injured and dangerously close to a blackout thanks to his fight with Rosine and her scores of pseudo-apostles, Guts dispatched at least a dozen Holy Iron Chain Knights even as he was trying to escape with his massive sword. Azan, being their trainer, had to have some faith in his men that they could fight and win, but Serpico pointed out the truth of the situation. The Holy Iron Chain Knights were colloquially called the Pretty Boy Knights because their ranks were made up of sons of nobility with no real combat experience to speak of. While he hated admitting this was the fact of the matter at hand, after losing so many of his men, Azan told Farnace that Serpico was right. They couldn't afford any more casualties during their holy quest, and if they just kept throwing men at Guts, their losses would be enormous. As he pulls down his Kabuto-inspired helm's visor, he requests that Farnace entrust the task of securing the Black Swordsman to him, and this is when we learn he isn't just some fat old fool obsessed with religion and the guise of duty, he's the real deal. A semi-retired veteran who's a hidden legend. Azan the Bridge Knight. Chapter 120 opens with Azan stepping up to Guts and challenging him to a one-on-one duel. Where they'd been begging the Black Swordsman to not hurt them before, they were now crying out for vengeance because they knew their trainer was no small fry. Azan twirled his iron staff in the air while laying down the gauntlet for Guts, and as he did so, he called himself both the Vice Commander of the Holy Iron Chain Knights and Iron Club Azan. In certain translations, he calls himself the Iron Staff Demon Azan, but both of those nicknames fit his past, for he is quite the distinguished warrior. So much so that he's one of the few characters whom Guts recognizes solely based on reputation, and he asks him if he was also called Azan the Bridge Knight. The old warrior laughs at being called by his old epithet, and this is when we get a little slice of Azan's backstory. Turns out, when Guts was a kid, he heard a story about an eccentric knight who protected an old wounded man stranded upon a bridge. This knight took on 100 mounted warriors just to ensure that the man could pass the bridge safely, and while he says that people laughed at him for his selfless and somewhat foolish act, Azan declares that a knight has a certain just path to follow. His men, who weren't aware of his past, call the tale of the Bridge Knight a good story, and Azan a paragon of knighthood, and they aren't too far off the mark. Though he has cause to serve religion now, Azan has always upheld the true ideals of knighthood, and having been recognized, he asks his opponent for his name, for that's how knights get down to business. Guts brushes off the notion that he's a knight by telling Azan to just call him Guts, which is fair since his knighthood wasn't technically confirmed. But this moment shows us the true meaning of honor between proper warriors. Both of them recognize the other's skills, and even though Guts is close to a blackout, he's itching to test his skills against this relic of Western history. As for Azan, his character and backstory seem to be inspired by a legendary Japanese warrior monk from the Heian era whose name was Saito Musashibo Benkei. Like Azan, Benkei was an eccentric man who started his life off as a monk and then became an ascetic and then transitioned into the life of a rogue warrior. Azan's life seems to have taken the opposite trajectory, but both of them have at least two things in common: their famous deeds and their weapon of choice. While Benkei possessed 7 iconic weapons, all of Japanese origin, the one Miura decided to give to his version was the Iron Staff, and while Benkei was a man who ended up getting involved in the dynastic struggles that culminated in the birth of Japan's first shogunate, the two tales most associated with his legend just so happened to involve bridges. As a warrior monk with a strong belief in the concepts of duty and worthiness, Benkei would roam the streets of Kyoto every night with the goal of collecting 1,000 swords from samurais who were unworthy of their title. After collecting 999 of these swords, he finally encountered a man who could defeat him in combat. His name was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and he was the half-brother of the first shogun of Japan, Minamoto no Yoritomo. They met at a shrine where, after seeing Yoshitsune's gilded sword, Benkei challenged him to a duel, thinking him unworthy. Instead of spilling blood on sacred ground, the pair agreed to shift their duel to the Gojo Bridge. Some legends claim that the encounter took place on the Matsubara Bridge instead, but that point is moot because all versions agree on one thing: the much shorter Yoshitsune managed to defeat the much taller Benkei not once, but twice, and in doing so, earned his service and undying loyalty. After Yoshitsune had a falling out with Yoritomo and was branded a rebel and an outlaw, he and Benkei were pursued relentlessly throughout Japan until their final stand at Koromogawa Natate. Sensing that defeat was imminent, Yoshitsune retreated into the castle to commit honorable ritual seppuku, while Benkei stood at the front of the bridge leading to the castle to defend his master's dignity. The legends say that he killed nearly 300 of Yoritomo's forces before they shifted gears and pelted him with arrows. They realized that trying to cross Benkei physically was next to impossible given his strategic placement and insane weapon skills. So they turned their focus to projectiles, and even then, they weren't sure if they'd killed him or not, for despite being pelted with arrows, Benkei still stood tall. It was only when someone went to check on his body that they realized he was already dead, and thus this event became known as the Standing Death of Benkei, an enduring legend of the kind of heroes that Japanese folklore venerates. You can tell which parts of Benkei's story Miura adapted for his own by just parsing through the details we've mentioned. He swapped Benkei's height for Yoshitsune's, made the Iron Staff his default weapon, and aged him up considerably, with the Berserk guidebook stating that Azan is 46 years old, where Benkei died at 34. Benkei's 300-man killing spree was reduced to Azan dealing with 100 mounted horsemen, but the impact of their deeds remains quite similar, even if the latters aren't as well known as the formers. Now that we have the history lesson out of the way, let's go back to Guts' battle with Azan for a moment, because like many of us, he initially assumed that this old knight with a wide gut wasn't going to be that much trouble for him. But then, Azan rained down a thundering flurry of blows, which forced Guts to not only stay on the defensive, but also acknowledge his opponent's skill and start thinking about a possible escape route. Their duel would have been something else if Guts was in full form, but because he wasn't, he used Azan's Iron Staff as a foothold to propel himself in the direction of the most valuable target in sight, Barnase herself. And while Azan cursed himself for putting his commander's life in danger, he sighed a breath of relief when she seemingly defeated Guts by herself and commended her for the effort. As Farnace shook from the anxiety of actually harming someone with her sword for the first time, Azan comforted her and reminded her that this was part of her duty. And when his men cried out for Guts' blood, he chastised them by saying knights don't just go around executing prisoners, and that asking for Guts' death was tantamount to tainting their duel. It's not an exaggeration to say that Guts is alive today thanks to him, and we see more of Azan's dutiful and honorable nature during the Conviction arc, where he really comes into his own as a character. For the first half of the arc, he questions why the Holy Iron Chain Knights are being tasked with acting as the bodyguards and escorts for the infamous Inquisitor Mozgus. Azan knew Mozgus's reputation as a torture aficionado and was sickened by his practices on a personal level, but being a dutiful knight, he did his duty, hunting down quote-unquote heretics within the vicinity of St. Albion, even if they were innocent people. It's the second half of the Conviction arc where he really shines, starting with the Holy Iron Chain Knights showdown and the possessed heretics within the cave where Slan's cult made its home. He was one of the few people who stood their ground and fought against the supernatural tide washing over all of St. Albion, and even though their victory at the cave was Pyrrhic at best, Azan didn't waver from his duty. After returning to the Tower of Conviction, he took it upon himself to organize the defense of the people when it became evident that some sort of evil miasma was spreading all throughout the holy ground. Azan knew that the odds were stacked against him, what with massive blobs of blood instantly devouring human beings left, right, and center, Farnace missing in action, and Mozgus having turned himself into some sort of fire-breathing angel/demon. But once again, he took it upon himself to see that everyone made it safely into the tower, and that his men held the gates no matter the cost. He had no way of knowing that the tower itself was unsafe at the time, so his actions were justified, and the fact that he lamented the loss of his men before celebrating his own survival during the incarnation ceremony shows you just how responsible of a man he is. The only reason Azan was alive was because his iron staff saved him from being crushed underneath the falling debris during the destruction of the Tower of Conviction, but instead of being glad, he was deeply saddened by the loss of so many lives. When the Kushan Empire followed hot on the heels of that terrible nightmarish event, he didn't waver or run away, instead choosing to ally himself with the ceremony's survivors, which included Guts, a man he'd been chasing just a few days ago. And when Farnace and Serpico left the Holy Iron Chain Knights based on the former's whim to discover her true self, it was Azan who took up the duty of returning to the Holy See's headquarters and turning in a report about everything that had occurred. For that, he was excommunicated, because the Sea couldn't exactly acknowledge the existence of evil spirits and still function as an organized religious body, but Azan didn't hold a grudge. He might have become homeless and penniless, but for the first time in a long time, he was free to choose his own path. Thanks to a stroke of causality, that path ended up reuniting him with the very people who had ditched him in St. Albion, and this is where the final third of his character arc comes into focus. A new mentor and an old future. Why Azan might play a major role in Berserk's final arc. After the Conviction arc, Azan resurfaces in the city of Ratanus, smack dab in the middle of the Millennium Falcon arc. He's sleeping on a boat at the pier, he only has his helmet where he previously had a full suit of armor, and when he realizes that Farnace and Serpico are back in the city, he insists that he doesn't know who Azan is because he feels ashamed of his excommunication. But the fact that he wakes up from slumber and immediately assists Isidro and Mule Wolfflame in beating back Bonebeard and his pirates tells us that even though he calls himself the Black Moustache Knight now, Azan is still the same honorable, chivalrous man we've known him as for so long. He didn't even think twice before engaging Bonebeard in battle, because all he needed to see was his peg leg and his eye patch to confirm that piracy was underway. And later, when Guts and friends commandeer his boat to reach Roderick's ship to sail towards Elfhelm, Azan acts as a stowaway because he feels like this is the best opportunity for him to redeem himself in his own eyes. Well, a part of the Seahorse's crew, he's put to work for illegally entering their vessel, and he does some backbreaking work, cleaning the floorboards and such, but when he's off duty, Azan spends most of his time training Isidro to become a better warrior, and this is where we see him regaining his spark as a character. Though he constantly berates Isidro for not fighting in knightly fashion and using whatever he can lay his hands on to throw Azan off his game, Isidro doesn't manage to land a single hit on him regardless, and this proves that he still has a long way to go. Isidro isn't a small fry anymore at this point in the story. He's been training with Guts for weeks and has survived more lethal situations than any kid his age. But when fighting Azan, he's reminded that flexibility and agility aren't everything in a battle, and he starts acquiring the true skill set of a proper knight. Azan takes part in several battles as a member of the Black Swordsman Swordsman party once they set sail. He's involved with the battle against the sea god and its tentacle minions. He helps the party make its way to Elfhelm safely, and he even helps them hold off the miasma spreading throughout the island as it's being destroyed by Griffith's actions and influence. Sure, he acts cowardly when the Kushan Empire commandeers his ship and takes the seahorse back to their homeland, but that's not because he himself is a coward. Azan's shame in that moment is greater than his skill, and once he actually reaches the Kushan capital, we see him shift his focus to the one person that needs him the most, Isidro. After Elfhelm's destruction and losing Yzma to the astral world, Isidro becomes quite moody and disillusioned. Shortly before Rakshas and a pack of trolls attack the Kushan capital, he was planning on skipping town to go look for her when Azan caught up with him. He offered to join Isidro on the road and properly mentor him, but before they could finish that conversation, the trolls appeared in front of them. This unlikely duo not only held them back, they ensured the safety of an entire section of the city, and we saw Isidro having a great character moment when he realizes that he can be more than just a great warrior. He can become a great knight who follows in the footsteps of both Guts and the most knightly character in all of Berserk, but only if he gives himself the opportunity to do so. While we haven't seen either of them return to the series after Guts entered the Kushan Stupa at the end of 382, we have a feeling that Azan's standing death moment isn't too far off, and there's a bridge perfectly suited for that at the moment. As of now, it looks like the good guys might mount a covert invasion of Falconia once Shirkei locates Casca and figures out how to use the sky paths to travel the city instantaneously. However, this is Berserk, and things never go as smoothly as our protagonists think they will, so the rescue effort is bound to end up hitting some kind of roadblock. We think that might be Griffith's apostles catching a whiff of the good guys having infiltrated the city, and at some point, Isidro and Azan, who will surely be involved in the rescue effort, will have to make a choice. They'll have to decide between running without trying to slow down the apostles or buying time for their allies to get to safety as they sacrifice themselves. Well, we say they, but based on the story of Benkei, that sacrifice will most likely be made by Azan, and it will probably take place on the long bridge that connects Pandemonium to the rest of Falconia. Seeing his other mentor selflessly sacrificing himself like that to protect the ideals that make knights who they are will most likely send Isidro over the edge, and he'll finally decide that in order to protect someone, he must kill someone else. So far, he's been hesitant to do that, but Azan's demise could prove to be the trigger that activates his transformation. If that happens, it will not only prove our statement that Azan is the only true knight of Berserk, it will also parallel the story of the inspiration behind his character beautifully, because Isidro would metaphorically commit seppuku and be reborn as a fully grown man in that moment. So all of these reasons, his honor, his battle experience, his chivalrous nature, and his undying sense of loyalty and duty are why we think that in a world filled with fake knights, Sir Azan, the Bridge Knight, is the only true one. But as is the case with all of our videos, that's just our opinion. Marvelous verdict! What do you guys think? Is Azan the one who best embodies the concept of knighthood in Berserk? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below because we'd love to get your take on this topic. We'll see you guys real soon with yet another Berserk video, so until then, stay safe, and as always, keep on struggling, strugglers.